Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of American Jew, The Interview. I am really excited to have with me today in the studio the creative director for Just Vision and the director of many films, including Boycott, which I'm a huge fan of, Julia Bacha. How are you, Julia?
I'm doing pretty good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming. We've been trying to get Julia to come be on the podcast for a couple months now, and I'm so grateful for her to give up some of her time to come on down and talk with us.
I'm really happy to be here.
So, Julia, I guess let's just get right into it. My first question for you is, how did you get involved with the Palestinian cause?
I first traveled to Israel and Palestine in 2004, and I went there to work on a documentary film that I thought was going to be a one-off with an Israeli human rights advocate called Ronit Avni, who at the time had the idea of building an organization that became Just Vision that would tell the stories from civil society on the ground that weren't getting any coverage internationally. And I thought I was there to make one film, but it's now been 20 years, and I have been working on this issue since then.
Wow. Okay. So, you mentioned Just Vision. Will you tell us a little bit about what Just Vision is and your role in the organization, please?
Just Vision is a media nonprofit organization that is focused on telling stories related to Israel and Palestine that are generally not getting coverage. We do that through documentary film, which is the part of the organization that I am very involved in. We also have a news site in Hebrew called Siha Mekomit, which means local call, that is focused on violations of human rights on the ground, investigations into what's happening in the occupied territories, and basically bringing stories to Israeli audiences that they're not getting through their regular media coverage. And we do a lot of public engagement campaigns with both our documentary work and our journalistic work.
How do you guys decide which stories you want to tell?
We are generally overarchingly focused on civil society, and we also want to work with stories that are have a potential to effectively challenge some of the master narratives that have clouded some of the realities of what's happening on the ground. And so we generally try to find individuals. Our stories are all character-driven that break through some of the prejudices and biases that have generally clouded the way we talk about Israel and Palestine.
Wow, that's awesome. I love what your organization does. You mentioned that you went there and you were going to just make one film, and that was nearly 20 years ago, and you've made a lot of films on the subject. What is it about Palestine and Israel that made you want to dedicate your work towards it?
The honest answer is that I didn't plan on spending practically my entire adult professional life on it. It really has gone from project to project as together with my team at Just Vision, we have identified stories that felt very urgent for me on a personal level to tell. I am motivated by people and by extraordinary individuals that I get to spend time when I'm making the films. I love that they challenge a lot of the preconceptions we have, that they are, despite the tremendously challenging circumstances that they're living in, they live with a very clear North Star of values and ethics. And I feel that those stories are often missed and clouded out from the way that we talk about Israel and Palestine. And so every time I get really inspired by another story, I start all over again. And it's never something that I am committed to doing, forever. It just really goes one story to another.
Okay, and it seems like your work has inspired a lot of people, which must be really fulfilling and awesome for you. I'm curious, before you went to Palestine and Israel for the first time, what were your views on the situation there, and how and why did they change?
So I The way that I became first interested in the Middle East, broadly speaking, because I'm from Brazil. I was born and raised there, and I came to study in New York. And I ended up focusing in Middle Eastern history and politics at Columbia University when September 11 happened. And so I actually, at first, was really focused on other questions related to the Middle East. I focused a lot on Iranian history in my academic studies. After graduation, I moved to Egypt and worked with an Egyptian American filmmaker called Jihan Nujaim on a documentary called Control Room, which was about Al Jazeera's versus Western media's coverage of the Iraq War. And that film was actually the film that opened my eyes to the power of documentary film. Up until then, that was not what I intended to do. And Israel and Palestine, in many ways, I felt for me was I was somewhat reluctant to want to go into that because it was a conversation that felt really toxic in America and very problematic. And so I actually did not, I'm repeating myself, but I did not expect that this was what I would be doing for 2 decades almost. But when I traveled to the region, all of that went away, it was just I understood things at a level and at a human level that I would have never understood based on the way that we get our stories told in the media today.
Well, as a documentary filmmaker, could you tell us a little bit about like your writing, shooting, and editing process?
Sure. So the films are all very character driven. And so generally, when we at Just Vision decide a sort of a broad theme that we're following, we start identifying many different people that we are going to follow for a while. So these are also, generally longitudinal stories that we may follow for 2 years, 3 years, and sometimes more. And it's really once we start editing that we do a lot of the writing because we let the stories of each individual to drive the narrative arc of the films. And so I would say, which was really how I learned with Control Room, which is that a lot of the writing happens in the process of editing what generally is an enormous amount of footage.
So I got turned on to you because of the film Boycott. And I was just hoping that maybe you would, tell everyone who's listening a little bit about that film.
Sure. Boycott talks about a bill in America that requires anyone seeking to do business with state governments to make a pledge that they will not boycott Israel in the name of Palestinian human rights. And if they refuse to sign this pledge, they are fired from their jobs. This is a bill that now exists in 36 states in America. And to this day, the vast majority of Americans have no idea that it's in the books and that it may affect their lives. The film specifically tracks the story of 3 Americans who, for very different reasons, refused to sign this pledge and decided to sue their state governments for violating their First Amendment rights.
Has there been any updates on Alan's appeal?
It has, yes. So the film ended in late 2021 was when we released the film. At that point, Alan Leverett, who is the publisher of the Arkansas Times, who had been told by the state of Arkansas that in order to continue getting paid for ads by state agencies like the University of Arkansas, ads that were placed in his newspaper, he was told you have to sign this anti-boycott pledge. And Alan himself isn't involved in a boycott of Israel, but as a newspaper man, he immediately looked at that requirement, and there were a lot of very flashing warnings coming through his head, and he absolutely refused. He refused to sign it on principled grounds. He doesn't believe that governments should be engaged in controlling political viewpoints of anybody, and his legal case has been fairly complicated one because he at first lost in district court, then he won on appeal, and then he lost on appeal again because the state of Arkansas asked the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals to hear his case again. And at that point, with 12 judges looking at this question, they decided that boycotts are actually not protected in America, despite the long history of boycotts being used for social justice movements. And therefore, currently, on all the states that are under the jurisdiction of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, there is no right to boycott. And that means that there's no right to boycott anything, because the right to boycott isn't something that was determined based on your opinion of Israel and Palestine. The question before the judges was, is there such a thing as a constitutionally protected right to boycott? And their decision was no. So today, if you want to boycott the fossil fuels industry, or if you want to boycott the gun industry, or if you want to boycott the state of South Carolina for transgender rights, or whatever you want to boycott as far as your morals and ethics go, you may not be able to keep a job in 7 states in America.
It's absolutely horrible. I think that should be like, the right to boycott seems like a fundamental right that's right along the lines with like freedom of speech. I want to ask you, you've been touring around showing this film all over the world. What has the reception to Boycott been like from the Jewish community?
By and large, it has been very positive. The American Jewish community, like all communities, are very diverse. It's not a monolith, and there are, many groups that support the anti-boycott bills, but there are as many groups who don't support the anti-boycott bill, and we have received, overarchingly a lot of support that sometimes goes along the lines of what we hear in the film from the rabbi of the largest synagogue in Arkansas, who we interviewed as part of the film, who says very clearly that constitutional rights and First Amendment rights are critical for the Jewish American population in the U.S., as they are for all minority groups in the U.S. That's one of the ways in which minorities get to, have appeals processes for advocating for themselves in this country, and so he was absolutely appalled that this bill was passed in Arkansas. And especially appalled that it was passed in Arkansas theoretically and supposedly under the name of protecting Jews, which is what the Arkansas state senator says on camera to us as part of the film.
What are some products that you think people should be boycotting?
Personally, I am vegetarian. I've been vegetarian since I'm 16 years old. And so that is a form of, of a boycott that I am very engaged in for many, many years now. I also try as best as I can to be conscious of the things that I am buying, mostly unsuccessful at that. It's really hard to be a ethical consumer these days. And people will make choices, right, about what particular matters and issues they will be more attuned to and attentive about. And that is the result of probably like many reasons, right? Like personal reasons, family reasons, movements that appeal to them, the success of campaigns and organizers at attracting the prioritization of individuals around the world. And one of the campaigns that has grown a lot internationally since it was founded in 2005 is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. This was a movement that was founded by Palestinian civil society in 2005, and that asked the international community to step in where states and international organizations and institutions like the UN Security Council or the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, had failed to hold Israel accountable for its violations of human rights. In the absence of any other way to hold Israel accountable, Palestinians made an appeal to international civil society to boycott, divest, and request their governments to sanction Israel until they respected international law. That is modeled after the movement against apartheid South Africa. That was an enormously important part of dismantling apartheid in South Africa. And many individuals and groups and churches and some universities have responded positively to that call, and that movement has grown a lot. And these anti-boycott bills are the result of that growth. As the narrative has shifted in the U.S., as we've seen, the last Gallup poll this year, for the first time in 20 years since Gallup has been polling Americans on their sympathies in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For the first time this year, Democrats are more sympathetic towards Palestinians than they are towards Israel. That is a huge shift over the past 2 decades. And, once you start losing the debate, once you can't persuade anymore on your cause, then there is the desire to crush the debate and to prohibit it from happening. And these anti-boycott laws are part of a broader movement that has been happening in the U.S. to try to shut down the debate regarding Israel's crimes.
What do you have to say to people that want to dismiss BDS as just being anti-Semitic?
I mean, I think, to be honest, the challenge is more for them to prove that BDS is anti-Semitic. But BDS is a boycott movement like that has existed historically and created by oppressed peoples for a very long time, right? The United States itself was created in large part under the symbolism of a boycott of British tea. The American idea of self was in large part created in this, one could even say like this capitalistic notion of just buying American and refusing to buy British products. The boycott campaign was actually a huge part of creating that sense of a national identity at that time. We certainly have seen boycotts being used by African Americans very effectively in the United States during the Civil Rights era. You could say boycotts was one of the main tools used at the time. There was the boycotts of the buses. There were boycotts in Port Gibson, Mississippi, which actually was one of the stories that led to the Supreme Court issuing a clear ruling at the time that boycotts were protected. So that actually sets the precedent, the legal precedent that has survived in America for a long time, that protects groups that want to organize and use, speak with their pocketbooks. Whereas an individual by him or herself refusing to buy something will not have an impact when you band together and you organize and you refuse to buy, or you organize a selective purchasing movement. That has proved to be very effective for particularly disenfranchised peoples. And the Palestinians are one of many groups that have tried that, and they will not be the last. Boycotts are going to continue to be one of the main tools for social justice movements for a long time.
Yeah, I think, boycotts are really great because they are a form of nonviolent protest, which I believe you're an advocate for as well. And I was curious, what do you have to say to people that think that change could only happen through violence?
So the armed resistance is protected under international law, so long as it's not, so long as it respects also international law, so civilians cannot be targeted. I am not, to be honest, in a position to argue what different methods people should or shouldn't use. There are a lot of good evidence that nonviolent resistance movements do lead to democratic societies. And as a student of history for a long time, I care deeply on what movements create and what do they generate as a result of their organizing. I find that nonviolent resistance historically has allowed, for example, more female participation and women to take on more leadership roles, which then can lead to societies in which women have more of a role to play in society if they have played a role in the movement that freed that society. And that's something that I care deeply about. And so in that regard, I think that nonviolent resistance can be a very powerful tool and has been a very powerful tool for many groups historically.
As a filmmaker, I'm curious if you have any recommendations of films that deal with Israel and Palestine besides your own that you recommend that people see.
So I am a big fan of a documentary film called Arna's Children. This was, I think, made in 2004. It tracks, I like longitudinal films, and it tracks Palestinians for, I think, over 7 years who were part of a theater, and then tracks them through the Second Intifada. It's really beautiful, and that would be my, I think, number one recommendation. I also love The Wanted 18, which was a film that Just Vision didn't make, but that we actually helped support in its distribution.
Okay, I'm definitely going to check those out. I'm curious, what's your next film project, Julia?
We are still in the research phase and not yet determined what's next.
Okay. Well, you've made several documentaries about Palestine and Israel. You've been to Palestine. And I was curious if, during your filmmaking process, if there was one particular experience you had that really had a profound impact on you that you would share with us.
Sorry, can you say that again? Sorry about that.
I was curious if, when you were in Palestine making some of your films, if you had any particular profound experience that really impacted you that you'll share with us today.
I mean, for me, I think the big experience that I was often facing in my work that I feel really privileged to get to spend time and get to be welcomed into people's lives is how much strength and how much courage there is on the ground, and how much resilience there has been, particularly from Palestinians who have really, survived despite tremendous brutality, having had to survive all of that is just extraordinary, and being able to remain as a community and as a society and over reinvent themselves, reinvent their resistance. For me, working on the documentary called Nile and the Uprising was particularly eye-opening, because the Nile and the Uprising talked about the first Intifada, which took place in the late 80s. And it was a mass civil disobedience campaign, a popular uprising that, by and large, is not to this day understood and known very well. But what happened at the time was that because so many of the original male leaders of the various political groups in Palestine had been arrested or deported from their communities, the Palestinian women had to take over all of these leadership roles. And they did a tremendous, they built, one of the most extraordinary civil disobedience movements that I know in history. And that, I wish this was something that we actually learned in school about, because it has so many lessons for groups around the world. And that was a really amazing experience for me to learn that and get to, play a small role in passing on that story.
There seems to be like a lot of ignorance about the Palestinian issue, and that, in addition to so much misinformation. As you've traveled all around the world screening your films, have you found maybe like one piece of information about Palestinian oppression that has really opened up people's eyes to want to accept the reality of what these people are living their lives every single day?
I mean, I think, people are changing and opening their eyes all the time, right? I mean, it's despite it being such an entrenched issue, things have changed. I keep going back to this Gallup poll because, as it's, Just Vision is actually turning 20 this year. And to be very specific, I've been with the organization for 19 years. And this Gallup poll, has been tracking American public opinion for 21 years. And I really experienced this shift, and I've seen the change in the tone of the conversation and what can be said and what can't be said, the ability of particularly Palestinian Americans and Palestinian groups in the U.S. to really push the conversation forward, and they've really done it, and they've organized, and it's powerful to see this moment. And I think the key question that we're facing now is that as the conversation has shifted, and now there's this effort to shut it down from the top down using very authoritarian methods and tactics. Will there be enough of a pushback? Will Americans who don't maybe care about Israel and Palestine, who are not yet committed to this issue, but will there be a commitment from so many, from a diversity of groups at this point, to protect this space to dissent? And if there is a pushback, and if there is a commitment to democracy at this moment, at this critical moment, then despite it all, I actually feel optimistic. I think that the conversation will shift, and I think as it shifts, too slowly for the Palestinians on the ground, but I do believe that it will have eventually an impact on the reality on the ground.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about Palestine and Palestinians?
I think the biggest misconception is this idea of a conflict, of this idea that there are these two equal parties on equal footing who have a dispute that they can resolve on their own if they only talk to each other, and the sort of massive disparity of power, the lack of a power analysis, as regards to Israel and Palestine. I think it's shifting. Again, I think people are beginning to understand, but I do think that is one of the sort of biggest challenges that Palestinians have faced in trying to really explain the situation for what it is, and increasingly I think people do understand, but there's still some ways to go.
Definitely a lot of ways to go. So, your films kind of highlight the occupation and how its effects not only are on Palestinians, but even on people in America. And I'm curious, I'm assuming that you get accusations personally of anti-Semitism. And I mean, how do you typically respond to those?
I've obviously, this is a reality that people face. I have been really lucky. That hasn't happened that often. And I feel the onus of such an enormous accusation of anti-Semitism is on the person who is making that accusation. And so if there is any real evidence of anti-Semitism, I will be the first person to take that very seriously over any groups or movements or things that I've said. Anti-Semitism is an enormous problem in the United States today. It's growing. It's dangerous. It's violent. And it's one of the key things that we need to fight, and we need to fight it together. And all minorities have an interest in fighting back against anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is in fact goes along with all the types of racism and discrimination and authoritarianism that we all want to fight back. I think that the way that the accusation has been waged is, unfortunately, I see I think there is some honest fear that I've seen. I also have seen a lot of dishonest use of that accusation to try to shut down conversations and shut down debates, and particularly in the context in which there's a community, the Palestinian community on the ground, that is daily facing enormous violence and oppression. I don't believe that it is, and I have seen it, so it's not just a belief, but I think that there are great number of Jewish American groups who want to make sure that the oppression of the Palestinians is not being done in their name, and to mix those two things up for a lot of Jewish Americans and Jewish groups that some that I have, individuals that I have documented in my film, partners that Just Vision has worked with. That does an enormous disservice in fighting anti-Semitism, which is a real issue right now, currently, particularly as we approach elections next year. It's already rearing its head again in many right-wing groups. And we've seen some of the worst violence over the past few years committed against synagogues in the United States. That violence is not related to Palestinian advocacy. And that differentiation between Palestinian activism and what people are calling now anti-Semitism needs to be made very clear so that anti-Semitism can be fought.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like it's almost become sometimes like the boy who cried anti-Semitism, and by, accusing anyone who advocates for Palestinian rights of being an anti-Semite does kind of water down these very real and very upsetting, anti-Semitic situations that are happening. But do you believe that because of Israel representing the Jewish people and its actions against the Palestinian people, that almost a new breed of anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, there's the anti-Semitism, the Jews control the media, the Jews killed Jesus, from the elders of Zion. But then there seems to be some anti-Semitism towards Jews just based on what is happening in Palestine. And that has turned people off to the Jewish people as a whole.
I think that the Palestinian advocacy that I have seen, and certainly, the BDS movement has been very explicit about themselves being an organization committed to fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of anti-racism. And that needs to continue. And that is a really important part of Palestinian advocacy. It shouldn't be on them to necessarily, have to do that work. But I think that being explicit and being clear about that is very important. And I have seen it done, by and large, very well.
Julia, what does the phrase "Free Palestine" mean to you?
I don't know that what it means to me matters that much, but I think that what I've seen it matter to certainly the majority of the groups that we have documented and worked with. It tends to mean that there is a growing movement, particularly among young people, of actually going back to what used to be a movement prior to the First Intifada and prior to the Oslo Accords, which was a call for a secular democratic government for all groups, of all ethnic groups on the ground. And that tends to be a growing way in which Palestinians identify what they want and what their freedom looks like. But it means a lot of things for different Palestinians. There are Palestinians who are still committed, actually, to a two-state solution, despite enormous settlement growth, and who still believe that that is the way. But I do think that the growing call for freedom right now tends to encompass and hope for a democratic country for all its peoples.
I think that's great. I think a lot of people, when they say free Palestine, they just want to immediately say, oh, that means the total destruction of Israel. And again, it's kind of a way to silence people who are speaking out. So I really love your answer. And, on that subject, I'm curious, what do you believe ordinary people can do to help the Palestinian cause, to help free Palestine, to help end the occupation, and to help have a state where it's democracy for all?
I think that generally in these situations, I think looking at what the calls are from civil society of the oppressed peoples is really important. So paying attention to Palestinian movement organizers is key, and they are everywhere. They are here in the U.S., they are across the country, they are in Europe, and certainly in Palestine. I think that educating yourself and your community, having difficult conversations with family members, all of these things really can seem small, but they do matter. And if people want to get engaged, there are a lot of organizations that are constituency-based organizations, which is not what Just Vision does. We don't do organizing and movement building. We are really focused on storytelling. But there are many opportunities for organizing. This is, I believe in grassroots organizing. I think that has proved historically to be effective. And so for people who care about this and want to get engaged, there are many avenues to do so.
So you've been involved with Palestinian advocacy for 20 years now. Do you think we are getting closer or further away from a just solution?
I think that the way that I like to think about it, because of the my work being a lot about storytelling and narratives and journalism, is a lot about where is the conversation and how far along are we in terms of getting closer to an honest assessment and understanding of the reality on the ground. And in that regard, I think that we, since I started working on this issue, I think that a lot of progress has been made. And ironically, the anti-boycott laws, as terrible, draconian, and repressive as they are, reactionary as they are actually evidence of the fact that so much change has taken place.
Is there something that people could do specifically against these anti-boycott laws that we were talking about a little bit earlier?
I mean, if people want to get engaged, there are many groups that work on this issue, right? So the film itself highlights the work of the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Right, Palestine Legal. There are many groups that are actively engaged in fighting against this bill in the court system. There's also many groups that are engaged in fighting against them at the local legislative level. Just Vision itself is not engaged in lobbying. We don't advocate against or for specific bills. We are about telling the stories of what's happening and making sure that bills like this don't go under the radar when they should be publicly debated and brought to scrutiny. But there are many groups like the Freedom to Boycott Coalition is one locally in New York for people who are here to look up. They do advocacy. And if people want to get engaged, there are many groups like them across the country.
So I think as we speak or sometime today, Netanyahu is actually meeting with Biden. What do you think about, them having that meeting? A lot of people didn't want Biden to meet with him because of what's going on with the extremist government in Israel. What are your thoughts about them meeting, and what do you hope comes out of that meeting?
I think that at this point, unfortunately, the Biden administration has shown to have very little interest in honest, true engagement on this issue area. I am not convinced that we can put a lot of hope on anything related to that meeting at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly, I have to agree with you, and I think it's very unfortunate just that Biden hasn't done more, which he really should have. I'm curious, you've worked with a lot of Palestinians on the ground. You advocate for Palestinian rights. Do you have a message to Palestinians that you would like to share?
I don't have a message for Palestinians, no. I mean, and I think that a lot of my work is really about storytelling and trying to widen the lens for the way we speak about Israel and Palestine. I feel incredibly privileged to get to do this work. I have learned an enormous amount, and I can only hope that some of that my learning and the work that we got to do at Just Vision over all these years have helped play a role in people becoming more thoughtful and hopefully also engaged. Just Vision itself is not actually doing campaign or advocacy, but there are many groups that are engaged in direct advocacy, and our work is supposed to be inspirational in the way that we hope that there are people that see our films and see the stories of individuals that, despite tremendous loss and enormous odds, are doing the right thing. That those can be role models. I think the media environment tends to focus a lot on sort of either political high-level negotiations, this idea of like Netanyahu and Biden meeting, and there's very little coverage and storytelling done of civil society, whether it be Israelis, Palestinians, or certainly with Boycott, where we brought some of this storytelling to the United States. But there are people that are fighting the good fight. And telling those stories are important in a media environment where those stories are not told. And so that's really at the core of what we do and what our mission is, and hopefully that can lead to continuing to support the change that we've been seeing over the past 20 years.
I hope so. I definitely want to see some change. A lot of people want to say that, Palestinians don't want peace. They refuse to accept peace. I know you've mentioned that you've, worked with different Palestinian organizations. Can you just speak to some of, the people that you've worked with that are Palestinians that are interested in peace, and, let the people out there know that these people are real and they do exist, and, this narrative of all Palestinians are terrorists and they want to murder all Jews, isn't the reality?
So I think that this is already part of the narrative, right? That is very problematic. What do people mean when they say peace, right? Obviously, everybody wants to live in peace. The question I think that is core here is that Palestinians want to have dignity, and they want to be able to have the same rights as Israelis have, which that, in the context of Israel and Palestine, that means that they want to be able to have access to school if they're a student. They want to be able to have access to hospitals. They want to be able to have freedom of movement. They want to be able to have freedom of speech. They want to be able to travel abroad. They want to be able to be in charge of their lives, which are the things that we all want. And they want to be able, by and large, to build a future that they feel is a future of dignity for their children, and that's what they are seeking, and that's what the struggle is about. It's really about how do you make sure that everybody has the same rights and is treated as in equal footing as far as their humanity is concerned. Right now, that is not the reality that we see on the ground, and Palestinians, obviously, like anyone, will not rest until that is the reality that they get to live under.
Speaking of the reality that Palestinians live under, apartheid is something that, they struggle with. It's a term that is said a lot now. It's coming out more. Ex-military people are coming forward. People that served in the Israeli military are coming forward saying, yes, it's obviously apartheid in the West Bank, but so many people refuse to accept that. They want to just, again, dismiss it as anti-Semitism. From all your experiences, can you just share with us why it is apartheid?
Apartheid is a legal term that has a very specific definition. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for people who are still questioning themselves on whether this is an appropriate word to use or not, to really educate yourself on what it means. And at the core, it means that there are two legal systems for two separate groups. And that is the reality in Israel and Palestine. Palestinians live under an entirely different system of law and governance than Israelis. And that is painfully obvious if you travel there. And you go to the West Bank, there's a separate system of roads. There are roads in the West Bank that only Jewish Israelis can use, and there are roads that are just for the Palestinians. The settlements are for Jewish Israelis only. Palestinians don't have the same access to the aquifers, to water, as the settlers do. The entire military system is separate, right? So Jewish Israelis, if they commit a crime, they are taken to one court system. Palestinians are taken to a military court system. It's a very clear separation of the law, right? The law applies differently depending on what your identity is and what ethnic group you were born under, and that is a definition of apartheid. And I don't find it controversial. I think there's now a lot of mounting evidence, and Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, which is one of the main Israeli human rights group, have come out with very extensive. I highly recommend their reports for people, and I really recommend people to read and do research. And I find sometimes a little bit tiring when people don't even go through the motions of reading what they're talking about and finding out definitions before they start arguing against it.
Do you, Julia, consider yourself more a filmmaker or an activist, and how do you distinguish between the two?
I definitely consider myself a storyteller, first and foremost. I have a particular lens that I bring to my storytelling, which tends to focus on the gaps that I see in media. I'm not so interested in repeating what's already being done well. I do my work based on what I see as the big missing pieces to the conversation right now. My work at Just Vision has been built around the issue of Israel and Palestine, and so the question is always like, what are the key stories that can help get us closer to the truth, get us closer to understanding what's going on the ground. And there is certainly a piece of this that is about inspiring people, right? I think, most people that I know who has gone into journalism because they want to have an impact in the world. They go into journalism for idealist reasons. They don't go to get rich into journalism, unlike other professions. And similarly, I certainly hope my filmmaking has an impact in the world around me.
Where could people find you, find out more about Just Vision?
So our website is justvision.org. And through our website, you can find links to all of our documentary films. You can also get directed to our Hebrew language news site called Sicha Mekomit. You can find out about how to organize screenings of our films if you would like. We are on the we're going to be entering the third year of the Impact campaign with Boycott, which is really exciting. It's alive and well. We're going to be screening in 2 weeks. We're going to be coming to the Harvard Kennedy School. We have a great lineup of speakers and conversations. Tonight, actually, there's a screening in Chicago that my colleague Suhad Baba is there. That is going to be very exciting. Almost every week, there are a couple of screenings happening. And we would be delighted to work with individuals and groups, universities who want to organize events with us.
Yeah, definitely check out the Just Vision website. Definitely check out all the films that Julia has made. I want to ask you one more question. There's so much hurt and hatred with what's happening on both sides with Israel and Palestine. And why do you think it's so important to, move forward for peace instead of just harboring this anger?
This is obviously a group of peoples that have gone through enormous amount of trauma and pain, and that is something that can be really hard to overcome because that generates so much fear. And at this point, I think there is enormous amount of fear that is entangled in all of this, and yet, I think that we need to come to this with a really open eye and clearly understand the reality that Palestinians are living under right now. I think that the eyes are being open. I think that change is happening. Israel, unfortunately, Israeli civil society itself has been moving more to the right. So everything that we've been talking about in terms of some of the shifts in American public opinion, that has not been the case in Israel itself. But I think a lot of the analysis that Palestinian civil society did when they launched the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was that in their view, there needs to be pressure and there needs to be consequences and accountability. And that unless that happens, unless there are consequences for Israel's behavior, nothing will ever change. And that is, an analysis that bears out historically in other contexts, certainly in the context of apartheid South Africa. There's no way that apartheid would have been dismantled in South Africa if there hadn't been enormous pressure internationally by civil society groups to isolate South Africa and to send a very clear message that until that system was changed, that South Africa would not be welcomed. And that is what the Palestinian community believes is necessary at this point. And so telling some of these stories is part of what we are trying to do, because there's been so little that sort of mainstream media has done such a poor job at actually documenting this movement and talking about it in a way that is accurate. And so a bit of what we wanted to do with this work is fill that gap.
Julia, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for everything you do as a storyteller to highlight what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and all your work with Just Vision. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. You can find me across social media at Jonathan Randall. See you next time.